Next pro forma to walk through is a project called The Shore in Portland, Oregon. This was the renovation of a car dealership into a gourmet grocery store in a trendy neighborhood in Northeast Portland. This was undertaken by a developer. The company is named Guerrilla Development, and they pride themselves on having a very artistic approach to development and also being very transparent about the work that they do. Unlike many other developers, the pro formas for all of their projects are available online. If you'd like to know how all of these really cool retail spaces for really offbeat food cart retailers who only sell meatballs with, I don't know, whatever silly things people do in Portland do. Their website is a great resource to find out about how this stuff actually makes sense. This particular pro forma is set up, even though there are multiple worksheets, almost all of the important parts of the pro forma have been stuck onto a single worksheet. However, that means that there are a whole bunch of tables involved, and so it's a little complicated to look at at first, but we'll walk through it step by step. In the upper left corner of the first worksheet is a section that's called Project Facts. This starts out just like the income calculation in the previous pro forma was. It shows exactly what kinds of spaces are involved, which tenants. The project facts show that there are 2 retail spaces in this building. The largest retail space is leased to a grocery store, and then the second retail space doesn't yet have a tenant in it, but there is a projected amount that is shown for the rent on that particular space. Project Facts also includes a couple of common spaces that are not rented out to the tenants. So there's a little bit of common area with the building. There's also a small parking lot associated with the building. These cost money to build, but they don't pay rent. But they are important to include in the project facts nonetheless because they do still cost money to build. The second table underneath the project facts shows project costs. You'll see again that there are roughly 3 buckets that project costs come in as. There is the acquisition of the building. This was an existing building, and so the acquisition cost is relatively high compared to the last project that we looked at. The hard cost budget on this particular project is not that high because, again, it was an existing building that was in pretty good shape and didn't need a whole lot of construction cost in order to update it to become retail space. However, there are a lot of line items here for soft costs, and then you'll notice that there's a separate worksheet which goes into even more detail about where those soft costs come from. Retenanting a retail building involves a lot of design work, especially for a gourmet grocery store. It involves a lot of legal work. A lot of professionals need to spend a lot of time in order to make this project happen, and all of those are soft costs that are included within the project budget. 2 of the professionals that are involved with commercial real estate development that you may not think about very often in regard to residential real estate development are leasing agents and also the developer. That this particular budget includes a developer fee, which is set as a percentage of the project budget. This is to reimburse the developer for the time that she or he spends pulling the project together and coordinating everything. You can think of it as a project manager fee. Oftentimes, we confuse a developer fee, which is the fee that is spent for the developer's time, with the return at the end. In many cases, a developer will contribute some cash to a project, and you'll see on this worksheet that this particular developer has put cash into the project. And generally, the developer will put herself or himself as the very lowest part on the capital stack. Therefore, they may not contribute very much in terms of cash to the project. They would have the highest return at the very end of the project. This is frequently because developers really believe in the projects that they are going to build and want to be able to have that that longest commitment to the particular project. The leasing agent fee is also in here because in order to show the space and to lease the space, developers and owners usually turn to brokers. Who advertise the space to retail tenants, to office tenants. And in order to make that match, an agent needs to be paid. The third table on this particular worksheet shows an operating budget for the space. After the space is built, it will earn income from rent, and it will pay out expenses related to keeping the building standing. You'll see that the rental figures here are pre-populated from the project facts above. So you've got the 2 tenants that are paying a certain amount of rent and occupying a certain amount of space. that means that they are paying a certain amount of money every single year into the building. You'll also see that there are not a lot of expenses involved with this. Commercial real estate is unlike residential real estate in that, generally speaking, a lot of leases involved in commercial real estate are what is known as triple net. That means that the tenant pays most of the operating costs of the space. And so the amount of rent they pay appears relatively cheap, but it doesn't include a lot. The tenant pays things like insurance on the space. They also pay the property taxes on the space. But there are a couple of expenses related to the building, like landscaping, that are paid by the landlord and that are shown on the operating budget. And then you'll see that the income minus the expenses results in the net operating income. Below the net operating income, you'll see that I've added a calculation for the cash on cost yield. This is the net operating income, so the amount of money that the owner of the building can expect to receive as profit from the building every single year, divided by the cost of constructing the building. This is a relatively simple way of understanding the profit margin that is available for a particular development, and it is often the way that a developer might evaluate an investment as a very quick way of understanding the profit margin. Yield on cost, which is net operating income divided by the total project cost, is often used by project sponsors as a very quick way of understanding the profitability of a particular investment. Will it earn me enough income after it is built to justify the cost of building this in the first place? Now let's move to the second set of tables that are to the right of the first couple of columns. The first two tables that are shown here are related to debt service coverage on this particular property. The net operating income that is on the property can support a certain amount of debt on the property. That can repay a bank that will have the first lien on the property. If everything goes wrong and they have to foreclose, they will get the first right in order to own the building. The very first table shows what a construction lender would want to know about this particular deal. What a construction lender is really concerned about, because a construction lender is lending money to a commercial venture before it's even operating. It's a very risky loan, but it's also not really related to the income that is being earned from the building because the building isn't built yet. Instead, what the construction lender really wants to know is how much of the total project budget am I going to be exposed to? They generally want to keep their exposure to a building to substantially less than the total project cost and have equity investors really take more of that risk during construction. This particular table focuses on the loan to cost ratio, which is a critical metric for a construction loan. You'll also notice that the construction loan comes with a pretty high interest rate. Again, construction loans are pretty high risk for a bank because if something goes wrong during construction, they may not get repaid. If something goes really wrong during construction and the construction lender has to foreclose, that's actually really a problem for a construction lender because they only have a half-built building. They have to deal with the risk of possibly completing the building. So construction lending is high risk, but it's also relatively high return for a bank. The second table on the right column is carryback financing. This is a second loan that is taken after the construction loan that is based on the net operating income of the property. So you'll see that this carries over the NOI from the first set of tables and calculates the amount of a loan that could be repaid with that NOI. The third table shows the cash flow projection for the very first year. And this is the first year that the asset is stabilized, the first year that all of the spaces are rented and are paying rent to the owner. The amount of debt that is on the property is carried over from the table right above it, and then the amount that is left is shown as equity to be raised in the project. So what this particular developer is doing is showing that this building will be paying out this much income every single year, which can support a certain amount of debt, and then there's still additional money needed in order to develop the building. So that amount of money is the amount that this developer needs to go and raise from equity investors who will not be repaid in the first year of operating the building, but hopefully will be repaid by the income of the building as it grows over time And then as the building is refinanced or maybe sold in the future. The very last table, and by far the most substantial table on this particular spreadsheet, shows an ownership breakdown. So in the table above, we've identified exactly how much needs to be raised from equity investors in order to make sure that the cost of building this building will be covered. And then you see below this an operating projection over the next couple of years, as well as a lot of lines for different owners in this particular building. So this developer went out to a large number of local investors and offered an ownership stake in the company that is set up to own this particular building. Over time, these investors will get a share of the net operating income after the lender is repaid, and they will get that share relative to the percentages that are shown in this particular sheet. And this is the kind of table that a developer will take from their pro forma when meeting with potential investors to show them how much income they can expect to receive in return for their investment over the lifetime of their investment in this building, as well as how much money they may be able to get from their investment at the time that the building is sold, or perhaps just when it's refinanced several years down the road, when hopefully the building will be earning more money than it is in the first couple of years of the building's life. In the final column, you'll see that the investors get more than their money back in that particular year. This developer is projecting that either the building will be sold to a new owner or it will be recapitalized. That is, the developer may stay in as part of the ownership group. There may be new owners brought in with a new equity stake, or perhaps the developer will get a new loan based on a projected higher amount of income at that time and take out the rest of the investors. That means to repay the rest of the investors and to buy their share of the operating company. You will see that this particular project is projected to increase its income every year, and as a result, the value of the property increases every year, and that is how the investors are projected to earn more than their money back at the end of the period. This is the kind of table from a pro forma that a developer will take around and show to investors in hopes of getting them to invest capital into the project to begin with. There's also a critical return metric that's at the end of this particular table. That's the internal rate of return. This is annualized over the course of the investor's involvement in the project. This is the annual rate of return that includes repayment of their capital. And you'll see that this is a very critical metric for equity investors. The yield on cost is a critical metric that debt investors look at for a project. There are two very different ways of understanding the profitability of a particular real estate development that serve two different audiences, and that some investors will care more about one, other investors will care more about others. In many cases, equity investors focus on the internal rate of return because their investment is longer term, and they are interested in capital appreciation. They're interested in having a property that is worth more at the end of their investment than it is at the beginning. Someone who is more interested in receiving current income will be interested in the yield on cost instead. The reason why I bring up this Portland example is because the previous example did not include those two critical return metrics on it, that it did not include a yield and it did not include an internal rate of return, because it was assumed in the HUD example, because that was for affordable housing, that the particular investors in that project were not very interested in the return on their investment. And government, in providing most of the financing for that particular house, was really not interested in receiving any money back on its investment. But in the real world, when dealing with buildings like grocery stores, the lenders and the investors involved with projects like these are very interested in not only getting their money back, but also growing their money.